Honestly, I think we can start with point number 2 because it's only going to take 30 seconds for me to go through it.
Okay.
Specifically, we've been talking about proposing a change to the OCI specification, to the index specification. And there's an OCI meeting today and one agenda item that I proposed was some guidance on how to actually update it. So the initial guidance from the OCI community was the index schema version, the current version is 2, and they proposed that we update it to 2.1. But because it's an integer, essentially the JSON schema is going to fail if we update it to 2.1. So I'm going back to OCI and asking them for some guidance on how to proceed there. There might be some disagreement between having the index object that you want to propose either as a required field or not, and this is going to depend on whether this is going to be a breaking change or not. So I expect the discussion to evolve into a bit more disagreement than just, oh yeah, we're going to add the config object, but I really hope that we can get a straight answer rather quickly from the OCI community. So I'll update the CNAB channel after today's meeting if this topic ends up getting discussed.
Radu, I think related to that is I'm going to join for the first time today the OCI weekly discussion. But it might be
that's the one.
Okay. Are you joining?
Yeah. Okay. It's 10:30 my time, so it's
okay,
fine.
So it's not so bad. All right, cool.
Not so bad.
I think we can move on to the next agenda item, which is we've had a bug reported by Vaughn and Porter earlier this week around using a floating point number as a value to a parameter, which led us to realize that because we're using JSON schema for bundles, and right now we allow canonical JSON, sorry, and right now we allow JSON schema to be a part of the bundle. If you have a floating point number as a value to anything in the bundle, canonical JSON is going to reject that. I'll just link the issue in chat right now. And the question is, how do we want to proceed and make sure that we don't have any problems with floating point numbers going forward?
So I think there were a couple of proposals in the issue comments. The most recent one was from Ryan, suggesting that people just upscale to integers. I think no matter what we do, we just need to make sure that it's clear in the spec text and the schema we provide for validation that, like essentially you can't use floating point numbers in any of those kind of definitions.
Yeah, I mean,
or we find an alternative to canonical JSON, but I don't think there's something that can fit that need right now. But I think unless we move away from that, I think the only thing we can really do is just enforce the fact that those things can only be integers, and we make the necessary spec changes.
Go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, I think that's basically the approach we're going to have to take in order to stay on the timeline without being highly disruptive, is say, if you need floating points, make it a string, otherwise upscale it, or here are some other strategies for it. I understand why canonical JSON did it, and if we try and work around canonical JSON's limitation by allowing floats, then we're going to end up with the problem that canonical JSON eliminated floats in order to solve. Which is that imprecise ones can get represented differently by different runtimes, which means you lose the ability to hash and validate hashes. So I feel like the combination of Ryan's suggestion and Carolyn's suggestion is probably a good first pass that can help us live through the core 1.0 version while we maybe find a better way of doing it.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, I don't see a possible way right now to not use canonical JSON because it's a rather central part of making sure that the same content yields the same digest, which is a fairly important part of the security spec. So I don't see an alternative right now to us using canonical JSON.
Yeah, I mean, if we foreclosed on that option, we would essentially be saying, so we have no path forward for integrating this data into Tough, Notary, in Toto, all the other systems that use canonical JSON. And that's from the entire reason we originally used canonical JSON was to make sure that we could get the same hash integrity that all those other security-minded things need.
So one thing we could do is use a custom type in CNAB Go at least, so that if someone did put a decimal number in, we would write it out as a string. So that if they didn't decide on their end to proactively handle it on their own, that at least we wouldn't end up with an unwritable bundle. But otherwise it wouldn't prevent them from doing their own things. We wouldn't force always writing a string or something like that.
At what point doing that, Carolyn? Is it in the tool definition? Is it in when reading bundles? I'm not sure I follow. So would it, go ahead.
So, well, right now we have floats. We have to put something looser, right? Because float doesn't work. Default uses interface, which lets people have full control over whatever it is they want to use, including their own custom types. So that works really well, actually. I kind of would lean towards that because it would let people have that level of control, actually. And then if we wanted to just have some sort of last minute check, because otherwise, like I said, the error message you get when you try to write, if you have a floating point, like a decimal, is really unhelpful. It just says, you know, like 0.5 is unsupported. And it's like, oh man, to get to that point is really frustrating. I don't know if it's really on CNAB Go to fix.
I don't think it is. I think
pretty much every tool, it would be unfortunate if every tool had to.
I think what we have to do is just constrain that to integer for the things that can be integers. And we're going to have our own kind of validation to support that because we can't reference, like right now our schema references JSON schema generically as the things that can be provided. We just can't support that because those things are not representable in canonical JSON. The thing with default is that like default applies to all types, not just numeric types. So it can be, that's why it's interface. It can be anything. I think if we kind of work around like coercing things into integer or into strings when they provide a decimal number or a floating point number, doesn't really work because like you're going to explicitly say that that's a numeric type and you're going to like end up representing something as a stringified value. Seems like not a super tenable thing. I think the better thing to do is to just force it to be integers.
Ryan's suggestion of scaling it.
In our spec, we just say like it can only be integers, and then if you provide something that's not an integer, we can fail in CNAB Go.
Yeah, which brings me to my follow-up question on that, which is, should we try to take the user input value and make it a string or make it work in some way, or should we just fail with a helpful error message?
Well, Jeremy was saying that in order to have it meet the schema, right, of canonical JSON, you can't coerce it to a string because it wouldn't be an integer at that point.
I think technically nothing prevents you from sticking in a float into a string. It's not like canonical JSON would know what you mean by the string, but the question of whether we should do it automatically for the user is interesting. I mean, I probably err on the simplest thing, which is err out by default, and then maybe give a flag to like, if you really want to do this, pass this flag, we'll silently, cast it for you. What do you guys think?
From the CNAB Go. Oh, go ahead, Carolyn. Sorry.
I was going to suggest even just a helper functions. We don't have to re-implement it in every tool was what I was going for, really. Just because I implemented it in Porter, like looking for these and then flipping them over to strings originally, because that was the first suggestion you had. And I was like, but we're going to have to do this in Duffel too. And then I thought, maybe other tools as well, we're going to need this. And so I wanted to get it into CNAB Go, but you're right, it doesn't need to be, it probably shouldn't be automatic. But I go back to Jeremy's thought, which is if the schema says it's supposed to be numeric.
And it sees a quoted string, like it's going to be up to different validators to figure out how they handle that. And
I think I'd like to see whatever behavior there is spec'd. I don't think it's sufficient to put it in CNAB Go because other languages wouldn't necessarily benefit much from that.
Right.
I mean, we could set the schema to wherever we want it to be. We could say that, for example, maximum is an integer or a string that represents a decimal. But I don't know. It's starting to get into this weird territory where we're writing our own.
I just did a quick test with JSON schema validator.net, which is doing draft 7, and I declared a schema of type number, but then I gave it a quoted string, and that fails to validate. So if something says that it's a number, I think other schema validators are gonna expect that it's a number. So I think we should just say that these should only be integers, and we shouldn't try to work around with crazy things that may or may not be supported in other validation tools.
Yeah, I think that's a safe option, and we can revisit it later, can't we? Because we can always undo an error situation.
Yeah, we can always go forward and add support for stuff.
But as you said, we still have to stop using the draft of JSON schema 7 and use a customized version of it that says integer instead of number.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, so for the two issues that I have open, I'm going to update the notes here if someone else hasn't been updating them, is that for the CNAB spec issue, is that we're going to provide our own schema for the draft of JSON schema 7 that has integers instead of numbers for those fields, for really any of those fields. And then for CNAB Go, we're going to flip from float to int. And there's going to be no helpers or anything like that.
And this brings an interesting issue of us using encoding JSON from Go directly to unmarshal and marshal things before writing the final bundle. In CNAB Go, I think we should switch by default to using canonical JSON unmarshalling and error early. My question is, should tools implementing the spec do the same thing, or it's up to the implementer themselves? But I think failing fast for things that are not supported should be default.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I mean, the usual proviso is to be strict in what you produce, and whatever the expression is, permissive in what you consume. So certainly agree that we should be producing canonical JSON, but if we get something that sees them it's not canonical JSON, then I don't have a problem with accepting it.
The spec says that it has to be canonical JSON.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but if it's not, then it's up to the implementation whether it tries to cope with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree to that. That's what I was saying. I would be okay with us having some implementation for coercing numbers to strings in CNAB Go, but I wouldn't want that to be the default behavior.
Yeah, the only security thing that I could see from accepting non-canonical JSON is that you may not know how to hash it. There's no standard way to do it. That's the only danger that I can see right now. You may have invalid signatures, but other than that, it should be okay.
Anything else on this issue that you want to cover?
No, I think we've covered that one pretty well.
Okay, then the final point on the agenda for today was an update on the security spec. And Trishang, do you want to talk about the diagram that you've produced at the end of last week?
Yeah, sure. So let me pull up an image that, am I sharing my screen? No. So let me download the image. So I can also show what we discussed last week. Okay, downloaded that. Let me open it. So I share my screen, Zoom, share my screen. Okay, so this is basically what Radu and I discussed last week. Oh, it doesn't make full sense. Let me, that better? Oops. Okay, I think everyone should be able to see everything now. Use this too. Okay, great. So basically we figured out 3 things, right? The model that I suggested, the way Notary works right now, and I'm not saying that this is the way we must do things. I'm thinking this is just the sanest way to do things, which is our typical use case will be a single organization right now, at least. We're not looking at necessarily public images yet, but that's not too hard to do. Oops. Fit maybe. I don't know how to make it. But the use case is that there'll be a single organization producing all bundles and all images, right? And so it makes sense to have a single TUF collection, basically a single TUF server, Notary server, hosting all of the metadata for you, including in total metadata here. The problem is that right now, Notary doesn't directly support it. The way that it works is that every image, for example, is signed using a separate TUF repository. So even if you're the same server, you can reuse the TUF key, right? So that's issue number 1 that we noticed here, is that even if you have different repositories conceptually, you can have them share the same root key. That's not the problem. So this is technically solvable. It's not the biggest thing, even if it's messy. Even if you use Docker Hub, for example, Docker Content Trust, or Quay, you can reuse the same root key for different images that you support. That's not a problem. The second thing that we need is delegations from administrators, what I call administrators of that image, to developers of that image, or even between developers and automation. Let me explain what I mean. So the way I envision it is you have a single TUF server, right? That's got all your bundles and images. And let's say you make a new image. This is a new addition between the previous week and the last one, is that I had this idea where you would delegate the keys of, let's say image 1 directly to the developers. And the reason it's green is that it's offline, signed using offline keys. And this is done by administrators of the repository, right? So between the administrators of the repository to the developers of the image. The problem is that this is very time consuming, expensive to do because of offline keys. Could be keys kept encrypted on USB sticks. So the idea is that automatically when you try to make a new image, a machine would delegate your keys for you. The downside is that, so the upside is that you get instant registration of your bundle and image. These should be called images. Let me fix that right now. So the upside is that you can get your new image registered by machines right away. The problem is that if someone breaks in a repository, they can totally switch your keys and your users would fall into, basically malicious images. So from time to time, what human administrators would do is that they would move the delegations from here to here and vouch for it using offline keys, making the delegation immutable. Does this roughly make sense to everybody? Okay, I don't hear questions, so I'm assuming yes. And the same idea for bundles. So the way you would make an image or a bundle for your repository is the same thing. The upside is you get instant registration of your bundle and image. So we're not blocking anybody. And then periodically you can build security by periodically moving delegations from the online source, keys kept under your carpet, as it were, to basically those signed by making it immutable, signed by offline keys. Okay.
Shashank, I'm not sure I understood the starting point actually, which was that you said something like all bundles will be produced by a single organization or something like that.
Yep.
But if my company wants to ship some bundles and some other company wants to ship some bundles and someone wants to consume all those bundles in the same platform, is that part of your scheme?
Yes, we can do that. So the way that we do it right now is that I'm assuming a single organization, right? So this might be private. I'm assuming a private scenario where you may not want to share this bundle and images. So I'm envisioning private consumption. There's no reason why you can't make any of this public. So you can call this server, for example, example.com, right? And then you can expose all of your bundles and images that way. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, provided there can be multiple organizations.
Sharing the same TUF collection. Yes.
I don't know. I mean, that's completely, I can't even frame questions on that front, but.
It wouldn't be different. I didn't want to complicate things right now, but you're absolutely right. We need to consider a scenario. And now that I think about it, it wouldn't look different either. It's basically the same scheme. You have different images produced by different developers. Machine can register those images right away. And then periodically, administrators of that public server will say, yep, okay, I verified your keys. I'm making them immutable right now.
Okay, so going back to your whiteboard picture, if you could just skip back to that.
Oh, the whiteboard picture, yes.
Yeah.
Oops, yes.
There'd be multiple routes.
That's the problem with Notary right now, is that there'll be multiple routes. That's the biggest downside. And
because if there's a single route, it means that somebody's got to run the world.
A single route means that, yes, there's one party. So let's call this, I don't know, we'll call this docker.io. Let's say they switch their Docker content trust model to something like this. But basically it's the Docker root. And all the root key does is basically distribute the keys for these 4 guys. And these guys shouldn't change for like in a year, at least. They shouldn't affect the operation of the rest. They're completely independent from the root. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, but it sounds like it's a bit of a limitation because we won't want to share a root in practice, will we?
Why is that?
Well, who would be the root? Where would we put it?
The root would be the administrators of the server. Basically, if you're using the server, so you can use the scheme for either a private organization, right? Which makes sense for all of them to share one root because you're making all the bundles and images. But even in the case of a public server, let's take something like, Docker Hub, right? Or Docker Content Trust.
Yeah.
If you have a single root and you basically outsource the responsibility to Docker, what you're basically saying is, I trust Docker to tell me the right keys for images and bundles. That's
okay.
all.
But my question is, does that scale up so that you can have other bundles with different roots?
If you want different roots for some reason, I don't see, well, if you want different roots, there's 2 solutions. The easiest one is you have a different server that you control with your own root.
Yeah.
And then you can tell TUF, use this list of servers. Basically, we have something called the map file where you can order even the list of repositories and so on and say, always get this kind of bundles and images from this private server first, for example, but everything else that you don't find there, you can find from the public Docker Hub, for example. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So to put it a bit more concretely, suppose Docker want to ship some bundles and Microsoft want to ship some bundles on an Azure registry and Google join in, etc. You'd have multiple routes, multiple collections of bundles, and the consumer could string together those routes to validate.
And different consumers can choose them differently. So one consumer can say, always prefer the Docker version first before Microsoft, Google, or say Apple. And another user can say, always use my private organization first before you try to look for it elsewhere. Or you can even say things like, if you don't find this image in my private org, don't even backtrack and try to look for it in public organizations, for example.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And one thing that I wanted to mention, which is how detailed should the CNAB security spec be with respect to key management? And I'm not sure. I think it would be okay if we gave a suggestion on how to do key management.
Yes.
I'm not sure that we should be prescriptive on how to do key management.
Right. We cannot, I agree with you. We cannot say that thou shall follow this model right here or you are incompliant. No, no, no. I agree with you. What the spec should be is to tell people, okay, if you're using this configuration of service, here's how you use stuff to download the images and bundles, and here's how you use Intoto to verify them, right?
I agree.
Yeah. And then as for how you set up the service, we can talk about, well, here's a suggested model, so you don't have to, you know, do all the hard work of figuring out how to do it for your organization. But here's an idea that we think would work. I should explain why there's this layers of, so first of all, I wanted to separate images and bundles, right? That makes sense. Whether you're sitting on a shared server or not. And then all this means is that these images were registered by machines, so you can use them, but they're not so trustworthy. And this one is definitely more trustworthy. And the way TUF works is that we use priorities and delegations. So you're always looking for images signed by authoritative sources here first, before backtracking and then looking for, in the worst case, in the machines here. Does it make sense so far? And then for image developers themselves, once you've delegated the image, what you're saying here is that developers are not going to be signing these images and bundles all the time. Most of the time, they're going to outsource that to a CI, for example, which totally makes sense. So that's what this means. They're saying for the tags of images, for the images themselves, the hashes of images, and Intoto link metadata, you can ask machines about it. They will produce new stuff all the time. However, we will sign using our offline keys the root layout for Intoto and the public keys for that. What this means is that you've basically made your software supply chain immutable. There's nothing that people break into the server, they can't change. Well, if you're registered here, they can always change it. But let's say you're here in claimed images. Then basically all of your metadata, your most important metadata is immutable. And so no one can mess with your software supply chain. So machines can sign digest for images all they want, but they need to follow strict rules about your pipeline. Does this make sense?
Yeah, just a question about the layers in the image. There isn't an assumption, is there, that the layers have to be signed, base layers have to be signed?
Well, I was looking at the spec for, what was I looking at? I was looking at the OCI spec for something, I forget what. You only need to sign for the resulting image. You don't need to sign for each individual layer, because the way it works, basically it's a Merkle tree, right?
Yeah.
So you don't need to sign for individual layers. As long as the root hash is trustworthy, you're okay.
That being said, there's nothing stopping you from adding a link to your Intoto metadata that specifies the signature for individual layers if you want to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me think about it. Individual layers, you're saying is I'm trying to think what the metadata would look like. Give me a minute.
Probably digests for individual layers, or even contents.
Yeah, that would be the most straightforward way to do it. Yeah. So you say, you know, here's my root digest, and here are all the layers, digest for layers, and for each layer, here's the Intoto metadata saying which developer signed it, which builder built it. Yep, makes sense.
Okay.
And which brings me to the next question, which would be, should we give a list of common Intoto verifications that could be done on a bundle or on images or on other artifacts? Again, not prescriptive, but a list of suggestions that people might use.
Yes, we should. We were talking about this last week, I remember. Right now, the ideal verification would be that you have reproducible builds. right? So you have two different builders building off the same source code and making sure that you end up with the same container. That would give you, but you can add that over time. That's one idea of a verification we can give.
Yeah, and I was thinking something even more straightforward, such as for an invocation image, you can extract the file system from the invocation image and check that the run tool has the following digest. And that would be an example of an in-toto verification for the invocation image.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the other thing you can do is you can check whether the source code the developer shipped, let's say this data, for example, is inside of that image.
Yeah.
Cool. What else is going on here? Let me see. Is there anything else we should talk about, Radu? Yes, we had a concern, which is that, so the first thing is that Notary doesn't support this out of the box, right? Having a single root for the entire server. So that's something we should talk to Justin Cormack about. So one idea is that we might have something like Notary version 2 that is known to be backwards incompatible with Notary v1. That's a good way to go forward, I think, instead of breaking things for everybody. That's one. The second issue is Notary needs to support delegations like this. So yeah, for example, here's this 3 layers of delegations, and Notary doesn't do that right now. The code can actually support it. It's just that the Notary tool itself doesn't let you do arbitrary delegations like this. So that's the second issue. The third is we need custom targets metadata in the tough layer to talk about in-toto links. And I think Radu says that they're there, and he's been able to do it.
Yeah, my current implementation already does that. And
Nice.
my question is, I don't think that we should keep the specification itself while all of this is worked out, since we don't want to be prescriptive about specifically the key management. So I think we can go forward with the actual specification that would indicate what types of metadata and verifications should be done for bundles.
Yep.
And this work and making sure that this layout works with Notary could be in parallel, not keeping the core security specification while we work through this. Does that make sense?
I think I understand what you're saying. Let me paraphrase. So one thing we should do, you're saying, is that we should separate. Maybe the spec definitely is too big right now. So one thing we should do is separate the verification workflows from the signing workflows, right?
Yes, and even more the key management itself, the thing that you're discussing right now, which is a future Notary v2 that would support the types of delegations that we want. I think we should put that work aside while we work to the security spec itself, since that would be a suggestion, not a prescription.
Okay, I see. So what do you suggest that the security spec should be right now? So basically, if I understand you correctly, so these are basically the signing workflows, right? That is really dependent on, mostly dependent on what sort of model you follow. So that's very prescriptive. So what do you mean is probably the verification workflows, which doesn't matter what key management layout you have, it's the same thing. You basically have to download a bundle and image and use in-toto to verify them, which should be the same no matter what you do.
Yeah. Would it make sense to go forward and have a more complete version of the verification workflow and then revisit the key management?
Yeah, sure. I think that would give us more time because really the verification is the easy part. You're right. The hard part is setting up the backend.
And hopefully we're not the ones who are supposed to figure that whole thing out.
Yeah, and we can mark the key management stuff as non-normative suggestive material right now, and then focus on the verification in the short term and get that.
I think that's a very good idea. It gives us very concrete steps to do that is easily achievable, if not in the next month or two. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I agree. So before I go further, does this roughly make sense to everybody? I don't want to go off proposing things that don't make sense to everybody, and that sort of thing. So if someone have questions, please do ask me and Radu about that now.
Yeah, and we're still are supposed to come up with a one-pager describing the whole workflow for registers and security, and we haven't done that yet. So that's one item that we should go ahead and work on. Something that is a high-level overview of the things, of the types of metadata and how it's stored in which registry, and also with a complete view of the registry work as well. So we should definitely work on that.
I agree. That should be here. This is what the introduction tries to do, but it's probably not good enough, and the roadmap. So yeah. Cool. Yeah, I think that's it from me, unless people have questions.
And we have one more agenda item. I think it's about pulling images by digest by default.
Yep, I added that to the agenda. Right now, we just don't have the digest available to drivers in CNAB Go, so they cannot pull images by digest. It's especially important for Kubernetes because you're not actually running the image on the machine that's executing the driver. It's going to go remote somewhere. So if you reference by digest, then you can actually lean on what the kubelet does to validate digests at runtime and prevent man-in-the-middle attacks where you might be getting different contents and you can't validate them locally. So I thought it kind of made sense to go ahead and the PR adds, instead of, we currently had, I think, a couple fields for like the image name and the image tag or something like that. This goes ahead and just adds the invocation image struct to the operation as a field. And I think we need that data anyway.
Is there any restriction on how the digest should be provided? I think right now in the base image struct we have a separate field for digest. Is your work right now expecting the digest to be provided in the image name or in the digest field? Does that matter?
My change adds the base image type to the operation struct, so you can see the actual base image reference to the invocation image and then use that. So the Kubernetes driver then constructs a reference to the image that includes the digest for pulling. The other nice thing about that is that you don't get the wrong thing if you have been pushing multiple times to the same tag. So you could safely use like latest or something and then provide a digest and know that you're getting the right one.
Yeah, I don't see a reason not to have that. I think that's a really good change, and I'm gonna go ahead and look at it closely and review that PR. And go ahead.
I was just saying this doesn't. I was just scanning through the code. It doesn't. It looks like it doesn't break backward compatibility with the old format, right?
It does serialize the operation struct differently. But I wasn't sure where we use that, if anyone has dependencies on that serialization format.
Is that using the claims spec?
That's what I was checking to see. Might be using
tests other than the one that test that you can deserialize. But
yeah, because this is looking like a relatively safe addition that adds some good functional. Yeah. All right.
And it works really well with the CNAB to OCI change, which adds the content digest when you push. So now we have a way to actually verify that at runtime. So that's really good.
There is one, I've added one comment. There's an image referenced in our tests that is private that I don't have credentials to be able to pull. It'd be cool if we could make that public or swap it out with a different image. Because I have no way of figuring out what the digest is right now to add it to our tests.
I just look at serialized in a claim, and I think it does impact, not in a backwards incompatible way, but I think we would want to start including digests in the claim as well, because we do have image and image type.
I think that might be backwards incompatible. If the operation goes into the claim.
I'm not sure if it's the operation or it's just similar sets of data. I'm just looking at like what data is in a claim. I didn't look at the code to see how it got in there.
Yeah.
I think it's okay to do a backwards incompatible change now because we haven't done a 1.0 release yet. And this is a good change to add, I think.
Yeah, I think we should look at doing the same thing to claims if they're not referencing operations. Should probably go ahead and just include the full invocation image instead of having a separate set of fields.
Yeah, I agree.
But I could do that. I'd be happy to do that in the follow-up PR.
Is there anything else that we want to cover today?
Jeremy is, I was a little bit late. Is there anything you'd like to share about the work you're doing in 113?
Oh, yeah, so I'm adding a generic, I'm adding an interface to allow you to validate digests on images, so invocation images and the reference images. The way that the drivers and stuff work right now, we don't pass around the extra, like the image map itself. We only have the invocation image. So this is adding a generic way that's kind of future-proof. So if we want to add VM support later, we can just add an implementation of this validation interface. Currently, it's using the logic from Pivotal's relocation library to validate things from a remote repository. So it's kind of, it'll be up to clients to invoke that themselves until we can work things out differently. Since we don't pass around that to the operation, like we could go and add all of the image map stuff to the operation if we want, but I think it's a big change for right now. So still testing it with Duffel, so I haven't marked it as not work in progress yet, but people can start, like Glenn already started reviewing it. So if anybody has any comments on that, go ahead and leave them on the issue.
Cool. That's it for me.
Cool. Have a good day then.
Bye.
See you guys.